This is a reading of the second part of Book 1 of an Aristotelian dialogue concerning the geocentric and heliocentric cosmologies, Contra Galileo. Again, this was written as a response to Galileo's dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, as a defense of the Aristotelian and Ptolemaic geocentric model of the cosmos, and as a refutation of the heliocentric model of the cosmos, as portrayed by Copernicus in Galileo's dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. And I am the author of the work, and you can find that in the archive and Amazon links below. Before moving on, I wish to review the main argument so far of the eternity of the heavens, of their ingenerability, their inalterability, and their incorruptibility. So far, we have already covered this, but I wish to review so that the present reading doesn't seem to come from nothing. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then to continue with the argument, we say bodies are either simple or compounded of such. And by simple bodies, I mean those which possess a principle of movement of their own nature, such as fire and earth with their kinds and whatever is akin to them. Necessarily then, movements also will be either simple or some sort of compound. Simple in the case of simple bodies and compound in those of the composite. And motion is according to the prevailing element. Then supposing that there is such a thing as simple movement and that circular motion is simple, and that both the movement of a simple body is simple and simple movement is of a simple body, then there must necessarily be some simple body which moves naturally and in virtue of its own nature with a circular movement. That was the first part of the argument. And now circular motion doesn't have as its contrary any rectilinear motion, does it? For we agreed that a thing can only have a single contrary. And further, that the unnatural and forced motion of a substance is motion in the contrary direction to that by which it moves in virtue of its nature towards its natural position of rest. Then, since rectilinear motion towards and away from the center are contrary to each other, and natural and unnatural to earth and fire respectively, and a single thing can only have one contrary, then circular motion won't be contrary to either of the rectilinear motions, neither of fire away from the center, nor of earth towards the center. And then we again are led to the conclusion that there must be some simple body different from fire and earth, as well as from air and water, which naturally moves circularly, just as fire moves upward and earth downward on their own accord. And there is more of this part of the argument which I wish to review before moving on to avoid confusion. Do you accept the following definitions? By heavy, I mean that which moves naturally towards the center as earth. And by the term light, I mean that which moves naturally away from the center, as does fire. Now, everything which has a principle of motion and moves naturally upwards or downwards possesses lightness or heaviness, or both, but not both relatively to the same thing. But the body which moves in a circle doesn't move either towards or away from the center, as circular motion was defined to be around the center, unlike the species of rectilinear motion. Then the body which moves in a circle cannot possibly possess lightness or heaviness, as those terms were agreed to designate bodies that move naturally towards or away from the center. And you would say, would you not, that the motions of contraries are contrary? They must be. If then this body can have no contrary, because there can be no contrary to the circular. Nature seems justly to have exempted from contraries the body which is ungenerated and indestructible. And further, it is clear to everyone that the two forms of rectilinear motion are opposed to one another by reason of their places. For up and down is a difference and a contrary opposition in place. Then we know that a single thing can only have one contrary. So neither upward nor downward motion can be contrary to circular motion, as they are contrary to each other by virtue of opposition of place. We also agreed that the only forms of simple motion are circular and straight. The latter, straight, being further divisible into upward and downward. So if the different forms of simple rectilinear motion are opposed to each other, and circular is the only kind of simple motion left without a contrary to another simple motion, for simple motion couldn't be contrary to a composite motion, then it is obvious that circular motion has no contrary, especially since circular motion isn't divisible into species the way rectilinear motion is divisible into upward and downward, marked out by fire and earth. And since we know that fire is the simple body that has the principle of motion, perhaps lightness that leads it upwards naturally, and that earth is the simple body that has the principle of motion, perhaps heaviness that leads it naturally downwards, we can be sure that the simple body that is neither endowed with lightness nor heaviness and which moves circularly is exempt from contrariety, since again, it doesn't even possess an attribute like heaviness or lightness to be disposed thereby in opposition to some other simple body which possesses the contrary attribute. Again, the syllogism was as follows. If then this body can have no contrary, because there can be no contrary motion to the circular, nature seems justly to have exempted from contraries the body which is ungenerated and indestructible. And now we can move on. I wish to repeat and start from the last line that I read in the previous section. Galileo. I am under the impression that I have been led to admit more than I wish. For while I thought you were asking about mathematical propositions, I was led to admit to a great deal more than I would have liked to about physics. And all the while you barely let me speak, besides in either affirmation or denial. I might have as well simply nodded my approval or shook my head in disapproval rather than say anything. I would like to take back some of the admissions I made to your questions, for at that time I didn't see the direction you were leading me through the argument. Simplicius of Cilicia. That is why I took the time to ask if you agreed from the start that the principles of magnitudes and bodies were part of the science of nature. And I explained how the principles of a science were useful in the investigation of that subject matter. I'm afraid you cannot take back your prior admissions after having already given your approval. I also made a point to say that I wanted you to adhere to the rules of argument, which you will forsake by taking back your admission to any of the premises. If you refuse to answer in the manner that dialectic requires, and you change your answers to prior questions, I can have no part in the conversation with you. I see that you wish to give a speech rather than ask and answer questions with me. Also, I would rather not give up the leading position of questioner quite yet, nor to exchange speeches with you. But I would like to hear what you find a problem with after going through the discussion thus far. Galileo. Now that I see where the argument was heading, I find problem with more than a few propositions you compelled me to agree to. Somehow I would not change my answer to much of the mathematical propositions you asked me about. Yet somewhere along the way, wherever those were transfigured into physical propositions, I would rebuke my approval. Simplicius of Cilicia. You agreed, however, that the principles of magnitudes and bodies were a part of the science of motion of magnitudes and bodies. Did you not? That essentially geometry is a part of the science of motion and physics. Galileo. I did. However, I expressed reserve about the applicability of geometrical terms in the course of physical investigations. Simplicius of Cilicia. And I also expressed reserve about the lack of precision in physical sciences, yet not in the sense that we used any of the geometrical terms throughout the argument, which I doubt contained anything indefinite in their use. I, for my part, wasn't doubting the use of such simple terminology. And what is more, there isn't a way to exchange them for non-geometrical terms, which is a telling factor about how physics is bound up with geometry. Galileo. I expect you avoided reference to the significant differences between the Copernican and Aristotelian cosmologies in order to gain my agreement to conclusions that I unexpectedly was made to agree to. If I may voice my disapproval, I will explain. Simplicius of Cilicia. Go on. Galileo. The premises were agreeable, and I know not which ones I would dispute with. However, there was a leap from those, for the most part, mathematical premises to conclusions of physics, which took me off guard, so that I felt the need to agree to them out of preferring consistency to the argument, all the while ignoring my wish to disagree with them at face value. It is for the sake of some of the physical conclusions drawn from mostly mathematical premises that I said I would change my answers to some premises. For the mathematical propositions themselves, I consider to be true, yet their synthesis into conclusions of the science of nature, of motion, I doubt. And no one Simplicius would be able to controvert these statements of yours. But all the same, those who occasionally hear philosophers argue thus feel in this way. They think that owing to their inexperience in the game of questioning and answering, they are at every question led astray a little bit by the argument. And when these bits are accumulated at the conclusion of the discussion, mighty is their fall and the apparent contradiction of what they said at first. Or, as in this case, great is their perplexing and unexpected admission of something which they would have before refused. I would like to proceed with my own account of the Copernican point of departure from the Aristotelian view, or else, regardless of my admission to unexpected conclusions against my initial opinion, the continuity of the course of the argument will be unclear and disrupted, both to me and to the listeners. Simplicius of Cilicia. All right, you may proceed. Galileo. I admit the argument up to and including the conclusions that the world is a body endowed with all dimensions and therefore perfect. And I add that as such, it is of necessity most orderly, having its parts disposed in the highest and most perfect order amongst themselves. Simplicius of Cilicia. Very good. Galileo. This principle being established, then, it may be immediately concluded that if all integral bodies in the world are by nature movable, it is impossible that their motion should be straight or anything else but circular. And the reason is plain and obvious. For whatever moves straight changes place, and continuing to move goes even further from its starting point and from every place through which it successively passes. If that were the motion which naturally suited it, then at the beginning it was not in its proper place. So then the parts of the world were not disposed in perfect order. We are assuming them, however, to be perfectly in order. And in that case, it is impossible that it should be their nature to change place and consequently to move in a straight line. So I say that it is impossible that anything should have by nature the principle of moving in a straight line. Although straight lines are somewhat indefinite and lack the completion that characterizes circular lines, someone might say that nature has, so to speak, arbitrarily assigned to them some terminus and has given her natural bodies natural instincts to move towards that end. And I shall reply that this might perhaps be fabled to have occurred in the primordial chaos, where vague substances wandered confusedly in disorder, to regulate which nature would very properly have used straight motions. By means of these, just as well-arranged bodies would become disordered in moving, so those which were previously badly disposed might be arranged in order through straight motion, through rectilinear motion. But after their optimum distribution and arrangement, it is impossible that there should remain in them natural inclinations to move any more in rectilinear motions, from which nothing would now follow but their removal from their proper places, which is to say their disordering. We may therefore say that straight motion serves to transport materials for the construction of a work, but this, once constructed, is to remain immovable and at rest, or if movable, is to move only circularly. And I should stop here to say that this argument is taken directly from Galileo's dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, although it might be surprising that such an argument is found by one of the leaders of the scientific revolution. But I did not alter that argument. To continue, Simplicius of Cilicia. When you use the term the world, do you mean the heavens or do you mean the earth? For, as you know, the term world is used in different senses, to refer to the earth or to refer to the whole, which includes both the heaven and the earth, or perhaps by figures like Empedocles in reference to the whirling motion of the heavens alone. Galileo. I mean by the term world, the whole, which comprises both the heavens and the earth, and I refer to all natural bodies within the whole. Simplicius of Cilicia. And when you speak about the production of order from chaos, do you also refer to the whole or to the earth and the elemental bodies beneath the lunar sphere? Galileo. I speak of order from chaos in reference to the whole, including both celestial and elemental bodies. Simplicius of Cilicia. Yet it is also true that in refusing the possibility of movement in a straight line, you have in your mind the elemental bodies, such as fire and earth, which are by others claimed to have rectilinear motion, the contradictory proposition that you deny. Is that right? Galileo. Yes, that is my intended meaning, of course. Simplicius of Cilicia. Tell me, do you consider the establishment of order out of chaos as generation, as I myself do? Or do you suppose that it is possible to avoid prefixing the term generated before the phrase out of chaos when discussing the production of order from the proclaimed prior disorder? Galileo. I consider order to have been generated, yes, out of chaos. And that is my intended meaning. Simplicius of Cilicia. You also claim that after the supposed generation of order out of chaos, at which point the optimal distribution and arrangement of the parts of the whole cosmos were set in place, it would be impossible for the parts to have a principle of straight movement. Is that the claim you make? Galileo. Why, yes, for only circular motion is preservative of the order of the whole cosmos. I also said that upon completion of the established order out of chaos, the only options for the parts and the whole would be rest or circular movement, since rectilinear motion would then only serve to displace them from their proper places. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then you either refuse the generation of elemental bodies, or you claim that the rectilinear motion of elemental bodies is part of the prior chaos, or you claim that the generation of order out of chaos refers to the generation of the circling heavenly bodies out of the lower sphere of elemental bodies that have principles of straight motion. One or two or all of those propositions must be your position. So tell me which of these three positions you hold, and I will restate them. Then you either refuse the generation of elemental bodies at all, or you claim that the rectilinear motion of elemental bodies is part of the prior chaos, or you claim that the generation of order out of chaos refers to the generation of the circling heavenly bodies out of the lower sphere of elemental bodies. So tell me which of the three positions you hold, or if you wish, I will refute each of them in turn as you hesitate to make a response. I will go through the impossibility of each of them in turn. However, I would like to address your claim directly beforehand. There is much to say about such a radical claim as you propose. So first, I will walk you through the steps of Aristotle's and my own argument for the necessity of rectilinear motion for the conditions which make generation possible and accompany generation and generated things. Galileo, go on with the argument. Simplicius of Cilicia. I will begin from Aristotle's wondrous question. Why the whole body of the heavens is not of the same character as the outermost sphere, the firmament of the fixed stars. I will ask your response. So he begins, by drawing out the consequences that would have to result if the outermost sphere, the firmament decorated with fixed constellations, were the only principle of motion, and if no other sphere within that possessed its own principle of motion, so that all the gradations of lower bodies were carried around by the diurnal motion of the outer sphere. So I ask you, if a given sphere is rotated, are not all the contained parts and mass of the whole sphere carried around with the outer surface, so that even the centermost globe turns with the same rotation? Although perhaps a magnitudeless point at the center of the innermost sphere would be exempt from rotating through a circumference of places, since it would have no magnitude, all in alignment with the outermost circumference. Galileo, yes, that is clear. Simplicius of Cilicia, then wouldn't you say that a single movement of the whole heaven, without any other separate motion, without any other separate movement of any of the layers encompassed by the outermost sphere, would necessitate an identical relation of the elements of bodies to one another? Galileo, I suppose so, yes. Simplicius of Cilicia, then isn't more than one circular body necessitated and required to account for the fact of generation, as well as for the fact of the planetary motions through the zodiac, or in other words, through the belt of the outermost sphere of fixed constellations? For the planetary spheres each have their own separate motion, different from the more rapid daily revolution of the outermost sphere, which carries them all around with it, so that each planet is carried around with the turning motion of the whole outer sphere, and also by a separate motion transits the circumference of the same outer sphere of fixed constellations. And these separate motions of the planetary spheres would not be possible to account for without the admission of the movement of more than one circular body. Galileo, yes, there must be separate motions for more than one circular body to account for both generation and the course of each planet through the zodiacal signs. Simplicius of Cilicia, or else, as we agreed, the elements and bodies contained in the outermost sphere, if that were the only principle of motion, would be indifferently homogeneous in identical relation to one another. Again, or else, as we agreed, the elements and bodies contained in the outermost sphere, if that were the only principle of motion, would be indifferently homogeneous in identical relation to one another, right? Galileo, yes, as we said already. Simplicius of Cilicia, then we agree that at least additional circular motions besides that of the outermost sphere are necessary to account for generation. Now, it is my place to prove the necessity of rectilinear motion, likewise, to account for generation. That is my challenge, as you have said it before me, having denied the possibility of rectilinear motion both in general and in a well-ordered cosmos. As additional or multiple circular motions were agreed upon as required to account for generation, I suggest that rectilinear motion is not only required for accounting for the fact of generation, but is further involved with generated things themselves. So, Galileo, even if you deny that the elemental bodies from which generated things are composed of don't adhere to rectilinear motion, upon which such a preposterous claim I have only contempt, you must admit this, that generated composite things are synthesized from elemental bodies, earth, water, air, and fire. Is that agreeable to you? Galileo, of course I agree with that. Simplicius of Cilicia, the next step is to inquire into the path that the elemental bodies take in combining to form composites. I doubt you would suppose that those elemental bodies intermingle in the formation of composites along some circumference. Is it not altogether more appropriate to say that the contact between earth, fire, water, and air must take place along rectilinear lines? For otherwise, one elemental body would have to encircle the next, and so on. And although the elemental spheres are enclosed within each other's circumference, indeed, when considered as a whole, the contact of the parts of air, of water, earth, and fire would be more reasonably considered as striking against one another along rectilinear lines, instead of as thought of as a sphere of fire containing a sphere of air and that of water and that of earth in the course of their contact and intermixture? Or do you think that the elements intermingle and synthesize into compounds through motion along a circumference, or through one containing the other within its circumference, and the other containing the next, and so on, rather than their striking against each other in the course of rectilinear motion in any direction? Galileo. I would have to further consider the question. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then in the meantime, consider this. Since we are investigating whether generation involves and depends upon rectilinear motion, as you deny that, we ought to turn to the consideration of generation and corruption themselves. For one, those are contraries, and their contrariety is between 2 points of time, one before and the other after, which themselves take place along a rectilinear continuum. So the whole course of generated and corrupted bodies runs from a beginning to an end along a line conceived of as time. Now, regardless of the speculation about whether or not time is circular and events in time recur circularly, the course of time spanned by a generated and corrupted body, having a single point of origin from which it proceeds to a single point of departure, would more properly be thought of as a rectilinear motion rather than a circular motion through time. So, is it not reasonable that generation and corruption are themselves contraries, and that they are always past, and that they are always placed along a timeline bounded by contraries, by contrarieties? Galileo. Yes, however, that doesn't go so far as to show that there is a natural principle of rectilinear motion. Simplicius of Cilicia. We will get to that point soon enough. Galileo, then proceed. Simplicius of Cilicia. Are not generated bodies subject to the contrarieties of growth and decay, and of increase and decrease, of hot and cold, moist and dry, of which states they pass back and forth from in alteration? And isn't change restricted to the back and forth path of such alterations, with the exception of some kinds of local motion? Galileo, yes. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then supposing all that, and contrasting alteration of all those types to the course of circular motion, which returns to the same point it left in a continuous movement, and designating alteration of opposite states as akin to the motion back and forth along a rectilinear line, which must stop at one end, say, upon becoming moist, before setting off for the other end towards, say, becoming dry, without the possibility of returning to the first point in a single continuous motion, but must be severed into two separate motions back and forth. Then, given that generated bodies are subject to various forms of alteration between contrary states, and that such qualitative and quantitative changes and alterations are akin to motion back and forth along a straight line, is it not reasonable to conclude that generated bodies should have rectilinear movements? Galileo. I would rather not determine the movement of generated composite bodies from considerations of parallels found in their qualitative alterations. Simplicius of Cilicia. Well, Considering that I am only attempting to argue for the existence of a principle of rectilinear motion among natural bodies, I should say that I find it surprising that if there were no principle of rectilinear motion in nature, there should still be an analogous parallel amongst generated bodies. I suppose it would be better to abandon this specific argument for the time being and to return to where we left off before. For I will attempt to find a different way to prove that there indeed is a natural principle of rectilinear motion which generated bodies are subjected to. Or at the very least, I will show the inconsistencies of your derived claim about the absence of such a principle of straight motion on the basis, as you claim, of the order out of chaos myth. For there are other tracts of the argument about your same claim, that there is no principle of rectilinear motion among the natural bodies that can be reverted to, since I cannot convince you of the presence of such a natural principle of motion in my most recent attempt. Galileo, then let us return to where we left off. Simplicius of Cilicia. You are saying that according to the major premise, the world is perfectly orderly, and to the minor premise, that rectilinear motion would only displace things that were already established in due order. There is no principle then of rectilinear motion among natural bodies. Were you not? Galileo, I was. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then I responded that if you deny that there is a principle of rectilinear motion set over the elemental bodies and their compounds, then you must either refuse the generation of elemental bodies or claim that the rectilinear movement of elemental bodies is part of the prior chaos, or claim that the generation of order out of chaos refers to the generation of the circling heavenly bodies out of the lower sphere of elemental bodies that have principles of straight motion. Now, I think these three propositions are bound up with each other, and that if we select one, we will in due course stumble upon the others. Galileo, take them up in whatever order you wish. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then, according to your own statement, that rectilinear motion can only have a place in nature until order is established out of the prior chaos, and the parts have all then been brought back to their due places. Would you say that the rectilinear motion of elemental bodies and their compounds is part of the prior chaos? Galileo, I should say that, yes. Simplicius of Cilicia. You said before, didn't you, that order was generated out of chaos, and that such a process was undoubtedly what we primarily mean by generation? Galileo, I did say that, and unerringly. Simplicius of Cilicia. And the generated order out of the priorly disorderly chaos, you said, referred to the establishment of circular movements of bodies, did you not? Galileo, I did, and for the reason that of movement, circular is the only kind that preserves and keeps order and doesn't displace the things in motion. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then you ascribe generation to the circular heavenly bodies, while you ascribe to the elemental bodies and their composites a place amongst the prior chaos. Would you say that? Galileo, yes. Simplicius of Cilicia. I wonder if you are backwards or upside down or you're inside out. Your conceptions remind me of the appearances of constellations as seen from latitudes south of 100-gated Thebes, which are from there unrecognizable to northerners. One would think they have journeyed to the underworld, for you call the celestial bodies that move circularly generated, insofar as order was generated out of chaos, and the only motion, as you say, that preserves order is the circular. While you must call the elemental bodies and their compounds ungenerated, since, as you say, there is no principle of rectilinear motion in nature once order is produced. And again, by order, you mean what is generated out of chaos. While you also said that the rectilinear motion of elemental bodies and their compounds is part of the prior chaos. Are those all points you would make, Galileo? Yes, they are. And along with my admission of the rectilinear motion of elemental bodies and their compounds as ungenerated, I also admitted that their only place in nature can be amongst the prior chaos, and also that the generation of order out of chaos refers to the generation of the circling heavenly bodies out of the lower sphere of rectilinear moving elemental bodies. And so there is no inconsistency in my train of thought, is there? For all this, you have unraveled from my first statement that by assuming the parts of the whole cosmos to be perfectly in order, it is impossible that it should be their nature to change their place from their natural stations. And consequently, I say that it is impossible that anything should have by nature the principle of moving in a straight line. As to your other statement, I should remind a staunch Aristotelian like yourself that Aristotle argues that what we call the southern hemisphere and the southern pole is upward and faces the top of the cosmos, while the northern hemisphere and the northern pole is downward and faces the bottom of the cosmos. Simplicius of Cilicia. We will continue to investigate your consistency or inconsistency. As to your reference to Aristotle's claim about the southern hemisphere facing towards the upper end of the cosmos, that is only for the turning of the outermost sphere, which if you lay on your back with your head facing the northern pole, admittedly seems to revolve from left to right. Yet the opposite is the case if you lay down with your head facing towards the south. However, the opposite is the case with the 5 planets and the sun and moon, which to us northerners move from right to left as a right-handed person throws. We have better return to the argument though and leave off with this digression. I think you will appear to yourself to be backwards, upside down, or inside out in what follows. Galileo, then continue with the investigation. Simplicius of Cilicia. You say that circular motion is a product of generation, while rectilinear motion is ungenerated. As you call rectilinear motion that which as from the primordial chaos. You say that circular motion is a product of generation, while rectilinear motion is ungenerated. As you call rectilinear motion that which as from the prior primordial chaos. Circular motion was generated from as order from chaos. Is that right? Galileo. Yes, that is right. Simplicius of Cilicia. You then think the celestial bodies were generated from the elemental bodies of the lower sphere. Galileo, that follows. Simplicius of Cilicia. Under analysis, it appears that you hold as a premise the statement that the better can have as their cause the worse. Do you hold that to be true? Or else you would never attribute the elemental bodies of the lower sphere as the cause of the celestial bodies of the upper spheres. Galileo, I must agree. Simplicius of Cilicia. Beyond that, you are the only person with such madness to think of generation as not belonging to the sphere of elements and composites of those. Besides you, there isn't a single person babbling in any town square throughout Europe that refuses to consider generation as referring to the composites produced from elemental bodies. So I insist you answer this. What else besides composites produced from combinations of elements could generation indicate? Galileo, I told you. As I have been using the term generation in the course of the argument thus far, I have in my mind the meaning of the production of order. For as you look to parts and the gathering of scraps into menial productions, I have my eye to the whole and the generation of the whole cosmos. Simplicius of Cilicia. Do you not realize that the term generation seems to be wholly restricted to the Do you not realize that the term generation seems to be wholly restricted to be used as to indicate the production of composites from combinations of elements? The same goes for the term given to the products of generation, that is, composites, as also for the term given to the materials from which those are produced, called elements. The meaning of these terms you hastily ignore in your vulgar dialect. One ought to wonder at your choice not to publish your written works in the Latin tongue, as to discover what sort of audience you cater to. For no man of letters would care to pick up a book that was written in such vulgar vernacular. Galileo, you need not personalize your assault. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then I'll broaden my assault. And if you don't answer my question about the use of such terms as generation, composites, and of predicates such as the combinations of elements, I will ask you about your master Copernicus, if he was not only born in Poland to Polacks, or if he was educated there by them as well. Galileo, I will answer your question then about the use of terms. When speaking about the generation, when speaking about the generation of the whole world, rather than a part, there is a difficulty in keeping to precision of meaning, much like we discussed about the application of geometrical terms to the physical sciences. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then we can safely agree that one or the other of us is utterly backwards, upside down, and inside out. As for me, I speak of generated things as composites produced from combinations of elements. And I assume that you speak in that way as well, when you aren't reverting to the argument at hand. Galileo, when discussing the various parts of the world and their transfigurations, I use those terms quite how you define them. Simplicius of Cilicia. And I suppose that you think they really apply when you say that order was generated out of chaos. For no one else actually interprets that mythos, that order was generated from chaos, attaching to the meaning of chaos the elemental bodies of the lower sphere, which combine to produce generated things on the surface of the earth, then interprets the order which was generated from chaos as meaning the stars and luminaries in their orbits, confusing both into your proposition that the celestial bodies were generated from the combinations of lower bodies of the lower sphere of elements. Galileo, such affirms only the ingenuity of my theories. Simplicius of Cilicia. We can move on to another argument that should prove more fruitful and profitable than the current argument. Galileo, go on. Simplicius of Cilicia. Let us consider what shape is primary amongst nature. For upon finding that out, we will have some leverage as to the problem of the question about whether bodies that are subject to rectilinear motion, as you say, can be the cause of bodies that have circular motion, which I doubt. So I ask you, if you agree that rectilinear figures are bounded by more than one line. Galileo, of course, 3 straight lines are the minimum that can encompass a rectilinear figure, as the mathematicians affirm. Simplicius of Cilicia. Yet, do you agree that curvilinear figures are bounded by one single line? Galileo. Yes, circular figures are encompassed by a single line. Simplicius of Cilicia. Do you agree that the simple is prior to and more complete than the complex, and that the few are prior to and more complete than the many, and that one is more prior to and complete than a multitude? Or do you think that the more complex can be thought of as prior to and more complete than that which is more simple? Galileo. I agree that the simple is more prior and complete, and the complex more posterior and incomplete. Then does it follow that the circle is most prior, complete, and primary amongst figures? Galileo. I would not dare to argue that point. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then, is not the sphere most prior, complete, and primary amongst solids, as the circle was agreed by us to be amongst planar figures? For it is alone embraced by a single surface, whereas rectilinear solids are bounded by several, at least 4 surfaces. Galileo. The sphere is indeed the most prior, complete, and primary amongst solids, as is the circle amongst surfaces. Simplicius of Cilicia. Here is something else to solidify your conviction. Have you noticed that those who divide bodies into surfaces or planes and generate them out of surfaces or planes seem to bear witness to the truth of this? Alone amongst the solids, they leave the sphere undivided, as not possessing more than one surface. For the division into surfaces is not just dividing a whole by cutting into its parts, but division into parts according to form. Then, according to the second method of division, of the division of solids, into other solids, rather than of the bounding surfaces of solids into plane figures. There is a further description to be provided about the indivisibility of spheres. By being bounded by a single surface, the sphere does not naturally admit division into 2 hemispheres. I say that spheres are not divisible in the way that octahedrons are naturally divisible into 2 pyramids, or in the way that cubes are divisible into 6 pyramids. I don't mean the more perfect kind of pyramids, whose base is a triangle equal to each other, whose base is a triangle equal to each of the other surfaces, and which are called tetrahedrons, but the kind of pyramids whose base is a square, like those wondrous monuments around the area of Memphis in Egypt, in proximity also to Heliopolis, nor how isosahedrons are divisible into 20 tetrahedrons, or by a different cut into 3 solid figures, with a pentagon as its base, the base of each the 5 equilateral triangles that meet each other at their vertices, with the omitted qualification that 2 remaining triangles would have to be disregarded, rendering the division of the isosahedron only strictly divisible into tetrahedrons according to that mathematical method of division. That is a long and about way to show that the sphere is not divisible, strictly speaking, according to mathematics, which was a topic we only brought up to exhibit that spheres are more prior, complete, and primary than rectilinear solids. Hopefully, this mathematical diversion wasn't a distraction from the premises which will follow. Galileo. I don't think that any of that diverts my attention from the argument. Simplicius of Cilicia. There is, however, a risk in losing the aim of a train of thought by pursuing some tangent. So, to get back to the argument, we agreed that spheres are primary amongst solid figures and that rectilinear solids are posterior. Now, you say that the only use nature can have for a principle of rectilinear motion is during the primordial chaos. You also say that order was generated from that primordial chaos, presumably from rectilinear moving bodies. Then you say that the order which was generated from chaos must have been the order of circular motion that we observe the celestial bodies to adhere to. That then is to say, according to your argument, that the bodies that have circular motion in the heavens were generated from bodies that have rectilinear motion among the lower spheres beneath the moon. I, on the other hand, argue for the contradictory hypothesis, about which I will take up again. We left off at the last point of agreement that circles and spheres are more prior, complete, and primary to rectilinear figures and solids. From that, does it not follow that the circular motion is also more prior, complete, and primary than rectilinear motion? Galileo, I will omit that point also. Simplicius of Cilicia. Well, the celestial spheres rotate circularly, do they not? Galileo, they do. Simplicius of Cilicia. And if there is such a thing as a principle of rectilinear motion in nature, that could only apply to the elemental bodies in their composites in the lower spheres. Will you agree to that much, Galileo? As the statement was qualified, yes. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then does it not follow that the circular movement of the celestial bodies is more prior, complete, and primary than the motion of elemental bodies and their composites? Galileo, given what was said before, that follows. Simplicius of Cilicia. Now, is it possible to account for the more prior, complete, and primary by tracing their cause to things more posterior and incomplete? Or do you say with me that the cause must exceed the effect in purity of whatever quality is transmitted? What I mean is this. If a quality of heat or whiteness or anything else is transmitted from one object to another, the object which is the cause of the same quality in another object will always exceed the affected quality in again. Now, is it possible to account for the more prior, complete, and primary by tracing their cause to things more posterior and incomplete? Or do you say with me that the cause must exceed the effect in purity of whatever quality is transmitted? What I mean is this. If a quality of heat or whiteness or anything else is transmitted from one object to another, the object which is the cause of the same quality in another object will always exceed the affected object in purity and strength of the effectually transmitted quality. Do you agree with me? Galileo, I must agree with you on that point, for obviously a fire has a greater degree of heat than that which it causes in an object that receives warmth due to proximity. That is your meaning, right? Simplicius of Cilicia, that is my meaning. So then you must also agree that the more prior, complete, and primary is the cause of the more posterior and incomplete, and not the other way around. Galileo, yes, that is plain enough. Simplicius of Cilicia, well, we agreed that circular motion is more prior, complete, and primary than rectilinear motion. since we previously said that circles themselves were more prior and complete than rectilinear figures. Galileo, that was said. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then, being more prior, complete, and primary, won't the celestial bodies that move circularly be the cause of the elemental bodies that move rectilinearly, since the more prior, complete, and primary must be the cause and not the effect of the more posterior and incomplete? Galileo, I am compelled to give my approval. Simplicius of Cilicia. Won't also it be impossible for the elemental bodies and their composites that move rectilinearly to ever be thought of as the cause of celestial bodies that move circularly? Galileo, again, I have to approve of the conclusion drawn, regardless of my personal convictions, at least for the sake of the argument. Simplicius of Cilicia. But according to your account of the world, rectilinear motion corresponded to the primordial chaos before order was generated, and an order which you say is restricted to circular movement, having no place for rectilinear motion. And now look how your inconsistencies emerge. In the scope of this argument, there can't even possibly be a doubt that the term generation can only be applied to bodies that move rectilinearly and can never be applied to celestial bodies that move circularly. Neither can there be a doubt that the elemental bodies and their composites can be prior to the celestial bodies that revolve in perfect circles, nor that rectilinear motion was prior to circular motion as chaos to order. And I will restrain myself from continuing with this flogging of you, so that we might sort out this confusion about ordering, about chaos and order, as that was the basis of your argument, and about which you don't stand alone, but with a seemingly limitless crowd, or rather horde, of others like yourself. Galileo, I must say, Simplicius, that the combination of the pressure of the Roman authorities that summoned me here and oversee our discussion, with your method of argument, provide conditions which restrict my defense of the Copernican cosmology. If we were freely discussing the subject at our leisure, I would be more able to contend with your arguments. Know that I have plenty more to say about these problems. Simplicius of Cilicia. And I'm sure that if you strip me of my method of argument and refuse to say simply whether you agree or disagree with each premise, and spun off on a speech in response to my questions, and especially if you had others to compound interest in the confusion, so that the topic wouldn't sit still, and any random one of them might interject with their opinion, I would be as much at a loss as you are now in convincing you and your friends in your usual habits of conversation. Now let us return to where we left off with the argument. I wish to prove that chaos couldn't have preceded order, and that the primordial motion before generation wasn't chaotic, and in turn, that order could never have been generated from chaos. I would like to hear an attempt at such an argument, said Galileo. Simplicius of Cilicia. That was the hinge on which our disagreement rested, wasn't it? Galileo, it was. Simplicius of Cilicia. First, tell me if you agree that circular motion goes from and towards the same point. That is, it has the same point as its beginning and end of motion, or in other words, advances towards the same place which it left in one continuous motion without stopping to turn back to its point of origin. Galileo, I agree with your statement. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then tell me if you agree that rectilinear motion begins from one point and ends at a different point. Galileo, I agree with that as well. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then you must also agree that rectilinear motion, having different places as its beginning and end, has to stop and set off on a second and separate motion if it is to return to the place it began its previous motion from. Galileo. I also agree with that. Simplicius of Cilicia. And I assume you agree that rectilinear motion cannot be infinite in duration, since the beginning and end points of motion along a straight line are necessarily different and separate. Galileo, yes. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then we might say that circular motion occurs from and to its place, whereas rectilinear motion is motion from its place to another place. Is that fair? Galileo. In my consideration, that is a fair thing to say. Simplicius of Cilicia. Do you agree that circular motion is infinite in duration, since the beginning and end of circular motion are the same place, and by one continuous motion it goes from and returns to the same point on the circumference, and that can be repeated in repetition ad infinitum? Galileo, yes. Simplicius of Cilicia. Now, which of the two do you consider to be more orderly? Rectilinear motion, which has as its places rectilinear motion, which has as its places of beginning and end two different points, and which must take up a second motion to return to the same place it set off from during its first motion, in which a returning motion is broken from the preceding motion, or circular motion, which has as the beginning and end of the completion of its course along the circumference the same point, and which returns to the place it began from with a single continuous motion. Galileo. I consider circular motion to be more orderly. Simplicius of Cilicia, as do I. Now, of which of the two do you consider to require an account of their origin, the circular or the rectilinear? Recall that we agreed that motion along a straight line is necessarily finite, since any place from which it has arrived from is where it must have stopped and broken the course. Recall that we agreed that motion along a straight line is necessarily finite, since any place from which it has arrived from is where it must have stopped and broken the course of its previous motion, and neither can it return to any beginning of motion without stopping and then advancing back in a second and different motion. And motion along a circular line is infinite in time, since the beginning and end of its motion are the same place, and it returns to its own place by the same continuous motion which it set out with. What is your answer, Galileo? I say that the rectilinear kind of motion requires an explanation of its origin more so than the circular motion. Simplicius of Cilicia. And would you say that circular motion, being capable of infinite duration, doesn't require an account of its origin? For an origin implies a beginning, and an infinite duration in time has no beginning. Or at least, do you see that we would amount ridicule by pointing to rectilinear motion in our account of the origin of circular motion? And that we are required to point to circular motion to account for the origin and beginning of rectilinear motion. Galileo. I agree with both of your statements that circular motion must not require an account of its origin, since it has no beginning in time, and that we are required to account for the beginning of rectilinear motion, to which it is reasonable to point to circular motion. Simplicius of Cilicia. We have agreed then that circular motion is more orderly, capable of infinite duration and time, and therefore doesn't require an account of its origin, and that rectilinear motion is less orderly and requires, along with its beginning in time, an account of its origin. Have we not? Galileo, we have. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then, circular motion cannot have been posterior to and dependent upon rectilinear motion. And rectilinear motion could not have been prior to and the cause of circular motion, as must be the case since rectilinear motion is the one that requires an account of its origin. And since circular motion has no beginning in time and doesn't require an account. Galileo, that is clear. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then you, along with so many others, must admit that order was not generated from chaos. Galileo, I fear you are correct. Simplicius of Cilicia. Well, dispose of the terms order and chaos momentarily, and also with the formula of the myth of order out of chaos. And set out again with me on an examination of the problem in terms of circular and straight or rectilinear motion. Do you agree that the primordial or preceding and ungenerated motion would have to be circular, given the predicates we assigned to that kind of motion, that especially it departs from and returns to the same place in one continuous motion without having to stop upon its return, and may continue over through the same course along a circumference again and again with a single continual motion ad infinitum? Galileo, I admit that point. Simplicius of Cilicia. And do you also agree that the kind of motion that was generated would have to be rectilinear, as all motions with a beginning and end that are to and from two different places are necessarily the product of generation? Galileo, yes, that much is clear. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then, regardless of chaos and order, we are in agreement that the only kind of motion that can and must be ascribed to generation is rectilinear, and that the circular motion of the celestial bodies has to be ungenerated, without beginning and the cause of generation, having been prior to all generation of rectilinear motion, and as obviously more perfect and complete than them. Can't we? Galileo, we can. Simplicius of Cilicia. Or else, if the primordial motion that was prior to generation was rectilinear, we would be required to find an account of the cause of that in turn, since no rectilinear motion can go on infinitely, but must start and stop at two different places, as limits terminating any one of its movements. Equally as absurd as not inquiring after the cause of the supposed rectilinear primordial motion is demanding a cause for the beginning of the circular motions of the celestial bodies, as they themselves, including their predicates, are sufficient to explain their origin and exhaust the search for their cause. Then obviously there is something wrong and backwards with the myth about order generated out of chaos, especially if the heavenly spheres are said to be among the order which was generated. Not only because they are perfect, complete, and sufficient as a cause unto themselves, but also because they couldn't have their cause something inferior to them. Since we have reached agreement about the nature and predicates of bodies that have a natural principle of circular, since we have reached agreement about the nature and predicates of bodies that have a natural principle of circular or of straight motion, something may be said about the order out of chaos myth. If by order, the circularly moving celestial bodies are meant, then, as we said, an absurdity would follow, namely that they who are themselves a sufficient explanation of their own cause will be said to be produced from something inferior to themselves. And that, I mean, rectilinear motion will be insufficient on its own to be its own explanation of its own cause. Then if by order is meant rectilinear motion, and the bodies that carries around, chaos will mean circular movement, which, let me repeat this. If by order, the circularly moving celestial bodies are meant, then, as we said, an absurdity will follow, namely, that they who are themselves a sufficient explanation of their own cause will be said to be produced from something inferior to themselves. And that, I mean, rectilinear motion will be insufficient to be its own explanation of its own cause. Then, if by order is meant rectilinear motion, and the bodies that carries around, chaos will then mean circular motion, which, although not subject to generation, will be dishonored by the quality assigned to them as disordered relatively to rectilinear motion and the objects that move thus. In which case it becomes obvious that there is at the root of the problem a divergence of views regarding the axiom that I mentioned earlier, that the inferior cannot be the cause of the superior. At the very minimum, then, the celestial bodies and their circular motions must be ungenerated and not subject to the story of order being created out of chaos, since that myth would predicate the quality chaotic of them. As we say, they are primordial to generation. Let me repeat this. At the very minimum, then, the celestial bodies and their circular motions must be ungenerated and not subject to the story of order being created out of chaos or anything else, since that myth would predicate the quality chaotic of them. As we say, they are primordial to generation, and that was a supposed establishment of order. Also, and this is directed at you, Galileo, rectilinear motion has a place in the scope of nature, since straight motion requires an account of its beginning or origin, and generation can only refer to objects with rectilinear motion and affectations, combined with the fact that we accept generation as a given. Recall also that this inquiry began from the aim of discovering a foundation with which to affirm a natural principle of rectilinear motion after you had said that there was no principle of rectilinear motion in nature once order was generated. And observe how what I argued for before has come true, that generation is bound up with rectilinear motion, so that by your own major premise, the acclaimed perfected order of the world, look what has followed. Not even the premise of order out of chaos remains after my most recent attack, but all have been overturned. I will pause there. And I must remind you that the arguments that I present as being Galileo's are, as the footnotes that I have provided show, the same arguments that Galileo made in his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, and that I am not making up Galileo's ridiculous responses.